The ropes bit into Elara's wrists, a raw counterpoint to the sun scorching her skin. The desert shimmered, heat rising in waves that distorted the distant mesas. Vultures circled, black specks against the merciless blue. Shed stopped screaming hours ago. Only a dry, rattling cough escaped her lips now. Caleb reined in Dusty, the big Appaloosa snorting, sensing the tension. Had been tracking a stray calf, but the vultures, they told a different story out here. He saw her then, a figure slumped against a weathered post, a scarecrow against the vast indifference of the landscape. He dismounted, his movements economical, almost silent. Years on the range had honed him, stripped away anything unnecessary. His face, tanned and lined like cracked leather, gave nothing away. He carried the weight of the West in his eyes, the harshness, the beauty, and the ever-present threat. He knelt beside her. Her eyes, swollen and bloodshot, flickered open. Fear. Then a flicker of something else, hope. She was young, barely more than a girl, her face smudged with dirt and dried tears. Her dress, once a faded blue, was torn and caked with dust. Without a word, he drew his Bowie knife, the blade glinting in the sun. He sliced through the ropes, the hemp parting with a satisfying snap. Her wrists were raw, bleeding. He caught her as she slumped forward, her weight surprisingly heavy in his arms. He uncorked his canteen, tilting it to her lips. She drank greedily, the water dribbling down her chin. He let her drink her fill, then pulled back, knowing too much too soon could kill her. He studied her face, searching for answers he knew wouldn't be readily given. Out here, silence was a shield. He saw the fear, yes, but also a spark of defiance. He had seen that spark before, in wild mustangs and cornered wolves. It was the will to survive, the stubborn refusal to be broken. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what had happened. He knew enough. Some things didn't need words. He knew the callousness of men, the greed that could twist a man's soul until it was blacker than the desert night. He knew the law was often a whisper in the wind, easily ignored by those with power. He gently lifted her onto Dusty, settling her in front of him. She leaned against him, her body trembling. He shifted his weight, adjusting his grip. He wouldn't let her fall. Not again. He turned Dusty towards the distant mountains, a silent promise hanging in the air, a promise whispered on the wind had get her safe. He wouldn't let whatever devils had done this finish the job. The vultures wheeled overhead, their shadows a dark omen, but Caleb didn't look up. He only looked ahead, towards the horizon, towards a future he wasn't sure existed, but one he was determined to fight for. One silent step at a time. Dusty picked his way carefully down the rocky slope, Caleb's grip firm but gentle around Elara. The mountains rose before them, jagged and unforgiving, their peaks shrouded in a hazy blue. As they drew closer, a small cluster of buildings emerged from the harsh landscape, the ghost ranch. It wasn't much a weathered cabin, a barn leaning precariously to one side, a corral made of rough-hewn logs. But it was shelter. 3 children stood in the yard, their eyes wide with curiosity. 2 boys, close in age, and a younger girl, her face partially hidden behind her brother's leg. They were Caleb's. He hadn't spoken of them, but Elara knew. She could see the same stubborn defiance in their eyes, the same quiet strength that he carried. Caleb dismounted, carefully lifting Elara down. Her legs trembled, unused to bearing her own weight. He steadied her, his hand lingering for a moment on her arm. Then he turned to his children. "This here is Elara," he said, his voice rough, unused to speaking much at all. "She'll be helping us out for a spell." The children remained silent, their eyes fixed on Elara. The older boy, maybe 10 or 11, stepped forward a pace. He was a smaller version of Caleb, all lean muscle and watchful eyes. The younger boy, a year or two behind, mirrored his brother's cautious stance. The girl, no more than 6, peeked out from behind her brother, her thumb firmly planted in her mouth. Elara managed a weak smile, but it felt foreign on her face. She was an outsider here, a disruption to their quiet lives. She could feel their suspicion, their unspoken questions. Caleb led Elara towards the cabin, the children trailing behind like wary pups. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft overhead. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. It smelled of wood smoke and something else, something homey, something she hadn't smelled in a long time. "Lena, get Elara some water," Caleb instructed the girl, his voice softening slightly. Lena, emboldened by her father's words, darted forward and grabbed a dipper from a bucket near the hearth. She offered it to Elara, her eyes still wide with apprehension. Elara took the dipper, her fingers brushing against Lena's. She drank slowly, savoring the cool water. It washed away some of the dust and fear, but not all of it. Caleb watched them, his expression unreadable. He knew he wasn't explaining much. He never did. But he also knew his children. They were tough, resourceful. They'd seen hardship. They'd understand, eventually. He hoped. Had simply told them what they needed to know and left the rest unsaid. Out here, a person learned to read the spaces between words, the weight of a silence. He knew Elara needed time, and so did they. The water settled, but the dust in Elara's mind still swirled. She watched Lena return to her brother's side, the unspoken language of siblings, a wall she couldn't breach. She felt like a ghost in their home, a specter of need they hadn't asked for. Days bled into one another. Elara helped with chores, drawing water, mending fences, tending the small patch of vegetables Caleb managed to coax from the dry earth. Her hands, still raw from the ropes, moved clumsily. She was slow, unsure, a burden instead of a help. She saw it in the children's eyes, the quiet assessment. They watched her every move, their faces betraying nothing. She wasn't their mother, wasn't even a neighbor come to call. She was an unknown, a question mark hanging over their simple existence. At night, she lay in the loft, on a thin straw mattress, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the walls. The children slept below, their breathing soft and even. Caleb slept in the barn, always watchful, always silent. Sleep offered no escape. Images flickered behind her eyelids, her father's averted gaze, her mother's tear-streaked face, the auction block, the leering faces of men, their eyes assessing her like livestock. The shame, a brand seared into her soul. She remembered the words, cold and sharp, barren, useless. They echoed in the vast emptiness of the night. She had been sold because she couldn't bear children. A debt paid in flesh and blood. Her own parents, they hadn't even looked at her as they handed her over. Just a quick exchange of coin and a lifetime of silence. One morning, she found Lena struggling to lift a heavy bucket of water. The girl's small arms trembled with the effort. Elara hesitated, then stepped forward. She reached for the bucket, her hands still clumsy, still weak. "Let me help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Lena looked up at her, her eyes filled with suspicion. She didn't relinquish her grip on the bucket. "I can do it," she said, her voice defiant. Elara stepped back, defeated. She knew the girl didn't trust her, didn't want her help. She was an outsider, a reminder of something broken, something unwanted. She turned away, walking towards the corral. Caleb was there, mending a fence. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. He just continued his work, his movements slow and deliberate. But she felt his gaze on her, a silent question. He saw her struggle, saw her failure. He saw the pain she tried so hard to hide. He didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply handed her a pair of work gloves. They were worn and cracked, stained with sweat and dirt. But they were also a silent invitation, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. Elara took the gloves, her fingers tracing the rough leather. She pulled them on, the familiar scent of leather and earth filling her senses. For the first time since she had arrived at the ghost ranch, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. A spark of hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the quiet acceptance of belonging, however small, however fragile, to this harsh, unforgiving land. Caleb continued his work, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a steady beat against the silence. The sun beat down on them, relentless and unforgiving. But Elara didn't flinch. She stood beside him, ready to work, ready to fight, ready perhaps to heal. Lambing season arrived with a brutal swiftness, a flurry of bleating ewes and frantic activity that swept over the ghost ranch. The days were long, stretching from the pre-dawn chill to the star-studded nights, and the work was relentless. Caleb, usually a solitary figure, found himself relying on Elara more and more. The ewes, heavy with lambs, needed constant attention. Some struggled to deliver, their cries echoing across the barren landscape. Others rejected their newborns, leaving them shivering and vulnerable. Elara, initially hesitant, surprised herself with a newfound resolve. The small, fragile lives demanded it. She learned quickly, her initial clumsiness giving way to a surprising dexterity. She assisted Caleb with difficult births, her hands gentle but firm as she helped guide the lambs into the world. She bottle-fed orphaned lambs, her touch soothing their frantic hunger. The small creatures thrived under her care, their bleating a chorus of gratitude. Caleb watched her, his silence deeper than usual. He saw the transformation in her, the way her eyes softened when she held a lamb, the determined set of her jaw as she battled to save a struggling newborn. He saw the woman she was becoming, forged in the crucible of hardship and responsibility. One evening, after a particularly difficult birth, Elara sat by the fire, cradling a weak lamb in her arms. The lamb shivered, its tiny body trembling against her. She stroked its soft wool, humming a wordless tune. Caleb watched from the doorway of the barn, his face etched with weariness. He saw the tenderness in her eyes, the unwavering devotion to the fragile life in her arms. A flicker of something akin to hope crossed his weathered face, quickly masked by his usual stoicism. He knew what it was to lose a child. The West took them as easily as it gave them. The graves behind the cabin were a constant reminder of that. Maybe, just maybe, Elara could fill some of that emptiness. Not replace, never replace, but heal. The unforgiving landscape stretched around them, a constant reminder of the struggle for survival. But in the small cabin, warmed by the fire and filled with the gentle bleating of lambs, there was a sense of peace, a fragile sanctuary carved out of the harsh wilderness. And in the shared labor, the silent understanding between Caleb and Elara, there was a glimmer of hope, a promise of a future that might, just might, be worth fighting for. The scent of wood smoke clung to Elara's clothes as she stepped down from the wagon, the dust of the trail coating her boots. Caleb had needed supplies from Redemption, the nearest town, and Shed insisted on coming along. Staying cooped up at the ranch was starting to feel like a different kind of cage. Redemption wasn't much a single dusty street lined with a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon that never seemed to sleep. But it was a lifeline, a connection to the outside world. Today, though, the air felt thick with something else. Something colder than the desert wind. Heads turned as they walked down the street. Eyes narrowed, whispers followed them like shadows. Elara felt the familiar sting of judgment, the weight of unspoken accusations. Barren, she imagined them thinking. Unwanted. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, trying to ignore the stares. Caleb walked beside her, his presence a silent shield. He didn't acknowledge the whispers, didn't offer any words of comfort. He simply walked toward her, his hand resting near the rifle at his hip. His silence was a statement in itself, a warning to those who dared to speak too loudly. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife, served them with a tight-lipped smile. Her eyes, however, held no warmth. "Caleb," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Heard you took in a housekeeper. Mighty generous of you." Elara felt a flush creep up her neck. She knew what Mrs. Henderson was implying. She wasn't a housekeeper. She was a charity case, a burden. Caleb simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Need flour, sugar and coffee," he said, his voice flat. Henderson bustled about, gathering the supplies with unnecessary force. As she rang up the total, she leaned closer to Elara, her voice a low hiss. "Some women aren't meant to be mothers, dear. Let's not try to force what ain't natural." Elara's breath caught in her throat. The words were like a physical blow, a reminder of her deepest shame. She wanted to lash out, to defend herself, but she couldn't find the words. Caleb's hand tightened on her arm, a subtle but firm gesture of support. He paid for the supplies, his silence a more potent rebuke than any shouted accusation. Outside, the stares intensified. A group of men gathered in front of the saloon, their eyes following Elara with open hostility. One of them, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, spat on the ground as they passed. "Taking in strays now, are we, Caleb?" he sneered. "Figured you had better sense." Caleb stopped, his body tensing. For a moment, Elara thought he might explode, might unleash the fury she knew simmered beneath his quiet exterior. But he took a deep breath, his hand still resting on her arm. "Mind your own business, Jed," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked away, pulling Elara with him. But in that single, controlled sentence, Elara saw a fierce protectiveness, a quiet defiance that warmed her from the inside out. The prejudice still stung, the whispers still echoed in her ears. But Caleb's stoic defense, his unwavering presence, was a shield against the cruelty. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in words, but in the way he stood beside her, facing down the store. And for now, that was enough. The wagon wheels crunched on the gravel road, leaving redemption and its venomous whispers behind. But the sting of Mrs. Henderson's words lingered, a bitter taste in Elara's mouth. She glanced at Caleb, his face a mask of granite. He hadn't spoken since leaving the store, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, a coiled spring ready to unleash. Back at the ranch, the children ran to greet them, their faces alight with anticipation. Lena helped unload the supplies, her movements quick and efficient. Thomas, the youngest, trailed behind Caleb, his small hand reaching for his father's. "Papa, can I help with the sheep tomorrow?" he asked, his voice full of eagerness. Caleb ruffled his son's hair, a rare smile gracing his lips. "All right, son. But you stay close. Understand?" Thomas nodded vigorously, his eyes shining with excitement. Elara watched them, a pang of something unfamiliar tugging at her heart. It wasn't envy, not exactly. More like a longing, a deep-seated ache for a connection she'd been denied. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sun painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and crimson. Thomas, his small frame dwarfed by the vast landscape, followed the flock of sheep towards the higher ground. Caleb watched him go, his gaze lingering on his son's retreating figure. Elara helped Lena with the chores, her mind preoccupied. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her, a premonition of something terrible to come. The feeling proved true. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, a frantic Lena came running towards the cabin, her face pale with terror. Thomas has gone. He didn't come back with the sheep, she cried, her voice choked with sobs. Elara's blood ran cold. She looked towards the canyon, its jagged peaks and hidden ravines suddenly menacing. The vast, unforgiving landscape had swallowed a child whole. Caleb emerged from the barn, his face ashen. He grabbed his rifle, his movements swift and purposeful. Which way did he go? He demanded, his voice tight with suppressed panic. Lena pointed towards the winding path that led into the canyon. He followed the sheep towards the mesa. I haven't seen him since. Without a word, Caleb started towards the canyon, his long strides eating up the ground. Elara followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. Caleb, wait, she called out, her voice breathless. I'm coming with you. He stopped, his gaze searching her face. It's dangerous, he said, his voice gruff. Stay here with Lena. I can't, Elara replied, her voice firm. He's just a boy. We need to find him. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He knew she wouldn't back down. And deep down, he knew he needed her help. Together they plunged into the heart of the canyon, the silence broken only by the echo of their footsteps and the frantic beating of their hearts. The search had begun, a desperate race against time, in a landscape that offered no mercy. The towering canyon walls seemed to close in around them, amplifying their fear, mocking their hope. The west, in all its brutal indifference, held its breath. The sun dipped below the canyon rim, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, before bleeding into an oppressive darkness. The air grew cold, biting at exposed skin. The vastness of the search area was daunting. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a cry for help. Caleb's face was grim, etched with worry. He moved with a relentless purpose, his eyes scanning the terrain, his ears straining for any sign of his son. Elara followed, her legs aching, her throat parched, but her determination unwavering. She knew what it was like to be lost, alone, and forgotten. She wouldn't let that happen to Thomas. As darkness deepened, Caleb found a small, sheltered hollow near a dry creek bed. He gathered fallen branches and started a fire, the flames licking hungrily at the dry wood, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. The fire was small, a fragile beacon against the overwhelming darkness. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. The shared anxiety hung heavy between them. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice low and gravelly. Mary, she loved this canyon, he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. Said it was wild, beautiful, like life itself. Elara knew Mary was his late wife, the woman buried in the small plot behind the cabin. He rarely spoke of her, and Elara sensed a deep well of grief beneath his stoic exterior. She died of the fever, Caleb continued, his voice barely a whisper. Took her quick. Thomas, he was just a babe then. Lena, she barely remembers her. He paused, his gaze lost in the flames. Elara remained silent, sensing that he needed to speak, to unburden himself of the pain he had carried for so long. I failed them, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Couldn't protect them from the sickness. Now I might fail Thomas too. Elara reached out and gently touched his arm, her touch light but firm. You didn't fail them, Caleb. You did everything you could. And you won't fail, Thomas. Well, find him. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability she hadn't seen before. He saw not pity but understanding. And in that moment, something shifted between them. She hesitated, then spoke of her own past, of a childhood spent in an orphanage, of the constant feeling of being unwanted, unloved. She told him of her desperate attempts to find a family, of the pain of repeated rejections. "I understand what it's like to be lost," she said, her voice trembling. "To feel like nobody cares. But somebody does care, Caleb. You do. And so do I." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The flames illuminated their faces, revealing the shared grief, the unspoken connection that had grown between them in the face of hardship. Tinyan, once menacing, now felt like a silent witness to their shared vulnerability. A vast, star-studded cathedral, sheltering two souls seeking solace in the darkness. The night was far from over, but for the first time since Thomas disappeared, a flicker of hope ignited within them, as warm and fragile as the fire burning between them. The fire's warmth chased away some of the night's chill, but not the gnawing anxiety. Caleb stared into the flames, his face unreadable. Elara, though, felt a shift. A sense, almost a pull. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she had to move, to search beyond the firelight. "Caleb," she said, rising to her feet. "I need to look further. I have a feeling." He looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's too dangerous to go alone. I'll come with you." "No," Elara insisted gently. "You stay here. Keep the fire going. Hell see it." She didn't explain the pull she felt, the almost tangible sense of Thomas nearby. She wouldn't know how. He hesitated, then nodded, trusting her instinct. "Be careful," he said, his voice tight with worry. "And call out." Elara moved away from the fire, venturing into the darkness. The canyon walls loomed around her, swallowing the faint light. She called Thomas' name, her voice echoing through the stillness. Only the wind answered. She walked slowly, carefully, her eyes scanning the ground, the crevices in the rocks. The pull grew stronger, drawing her towards a small, almost hidden opening in the canyon wall. A cave, barely large enough for a child. "Thomas?" she called softly, her voice trembling. A whimper answered her. Elara's heart leapt. She crawled towards the opening, peering into the darkness. Two small eyes stared back at her, wide with fear. "Thomas, it's Elara," she said gently, her voice soothing. "It's all right. I'm here to help you." He huddled deeper into the cave, his small body shaking. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I got lost." Elara crawled inside, her presence filling the small space. She reached out and gently touched his hand. "I know, sweetheart. But you're not lost anymore. I found you, and your papa is waiting for you." She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. He clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder. She could feel his small body trembling, the residue of his fear. "It's okay," she whispered, stroking his hair. "We're going to go home now. Your papa is waiting." Slowly, gently, she coaxed him out of the cave. The firelight seemed to embrace them as they emerged, a warm welcome after the cold darkness. Caleb saw them and stood, his face etched with disbelief, then overwhelming relief. He rushed towards them, his arms outstretched. Thomas ran to him, launching himself into his father's arms. Caleb held him tight, burying his face in his son's hair, his body shaking with emotion. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with gratitude, with something deeper. He opened his arms, and she stepped into his embrace, joining the circle of love and relief. It was a silent promise, a bond forged in fear and strengthened by hope. Elara wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was part of them. The canyon, which had threatened to swallow them whole, now seemed to cradle them, a silent witness to their reunion. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on their faces, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape. The West remained wild, but for this small family, it held a glimmer of something more, a chance at healing, a promise of belonging. The warmth of the embrace lingered, a comforting shield against the vast emptiness of the night. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of rose and gold, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as he approached the ranch. He was a handsome man, with a rakish grin and eyes that held a hint of mischief. His clothes, though travel-worn, hinted at a life far removed from the hard-scrabble existence of the canyon. Caleb tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards the rifle leaning against the wagon. He didn't recognize the rider, but something about his swagger set him on edge. The rider reined in his horse, a chestnut mare, a few yards from the cabin. He dismounted with an easy grace, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the fire, the family, Elara. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Looks like I finally found you, brother." Caleb's face hardened. "Jacob," he said, his voice flat. Jacob grinned, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "In the flesh. Long time no see, Caleb. Heard you were scratching out a living out here in the middle of nowhere." He turned his attention to Elara and the children, his smile widening. "And who are these lovely folks?" "A new family, it seems." "You always were a lucky dog, Caleb." Elara stepped forward, shielding Thomas and Lena with her body. She didn't trust this man, this Jacob. There was something unsettling about his easy charm, a sense of danger lurking beneath the surface. "What do you want, Jacob?" Caleb asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Just passing through," Jacob said, shrugging. "Thought I'd pay my respects to my dear brother. Besides," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I might be in a bit of trouble. Need a place to lie low for a while." Caleb's jaw tightened. "This is my home, Jacob, and I don't take kindly to trouble." "Come on, Caleb," Jacob said, his grin fading. "We're family. You wouldn't turn your own brother away, would you? Especially when he's down on his luck." He paused, his gaze hardening. "Besides," he added, his voice laced with a subtle threat, "I know things, Caleb. Things about the past you might not want coming to light." Caleb stared at his brother, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knew what Jacob was capable of. He knew the darkness that lurked within him. But he also knew the pull of blood, the unspoken obligation that bound them together. He glanced at Elara, her eyes filled with concern. He knew that bringing Jacob into their lives would be a risk. But he also knew that he couldn't simply turn him away. Not without knowing what secrets Jacob held, what threat he posed to the fragile peace they had found. "All right, Jacob," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "You can stay, but you follow my rules, and you keep your trouble to yourself. Understand?" Jacob's grin returned, wider and more genuine this time. "You always were a soft touch, Caleb." "Thanks, brother. You won't regret it." But Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they already had. Jacob's arrival was a storm on the horizon, threatening to shatter the hard-won peace of the canyon. And Caleb, bound by blood and haunted by the past, had just opened the door to let it in. The unease settled like dust, coating everything in a film of apprehension. Jacob, true to form, did little to dispel it. He spent his days lounging, drinking Caleb's whiskey, and regaling the children with tall tales that Elara didn't trust for a second. Caleb, ever watchful, kept his distance, his silence heavier than usual. The storm broke with the setting sun. 3 riders, their faces grim and shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, materialized from the canyon's mouth. Their horses were lean and hard-ridden, their saddles bearing the marks of long journeys. They stopped a few yards from the cabin. Their leader, a man with a scar bisecting his left eye, dismounting with a slow, deliberate menace. "Which one of you is Jacob?" the scarred man asked, his voice a low growl. Jacob, who had been whittling idly by the porch, froze. He slowly rose to his feet, his face paling beneath his tan. "I'm Jacob," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We've been looking for you, Jacob," the scarred man said, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "Word is you've been holding on to something that doesn't belong to you." Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between Jacob and the riders. "He doesn't have anything of yours," he said, his voice firm. The scarred man chuckled, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Stay out of this, old man. This is between me and Jacob. Anything he has is mine now," Caleb retorted, his hand inching towards his rifle. The scarred man's gaze flickered to Elara and the children, huddled in the doorway of the cabin. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, his voice softening slightly. "We just want what's ours. The gold. We know you took it, Jacob." Jacob shook his head, his eyes darting nervously between Caleb and the riders. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "Don't lie to me, Jacob," the scarred man said, his voice hardening again. "We know you stole it from the bank in redemption. Now, where is it?" Caleb's eyes narrowed. He hadn't known about any stolen gold. Jacob had lied to him, brought this danger to his doorstep. He glanced at Elara, her face pale with fear. He had to protect him. "He doesn't have it," Caleb said again, his voice unwavering. "You're not getting anything here." The scarred man sighed, a gesture of false regret. "All right, old man. You asked for this." He nodded to his companions. "Get the gold." The riders dismounted, their hands reaching for the guns strapped to their sides. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the snorting of horses and the rasp of steel. The storm had arrived, and Caleb knew, with a sinking feeling, that it was about to unleash its full fury. He was trapped between his brother's lies and the ruthless men who had come to collect. And Elara, along with Thomas and Lena, were caught in the crossfire. He had to act, and fast. The scarred man's men fanned out, flanking the cabin. Caleb leveled his rifle, the metal cold against his cheek. He knew he was outgunned, outnumbered, but he wouldn't back down. Not with Elara and the children behind him. "Last chance," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. "Turn around and ride out. Leave Jacob to his own devices." The scarred man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You think we're afraid of you, old man? We face down worse than you." He spat on the ground, the gesture a clear sign of his contempt. "Get him." The riders surged forward, their guns drawn. Caleb fired, the shot echoing through the canyon. One of the riders cried out, clutching his arm. But the others kept coming. Elara, her face pale but determined, raised the rifle Caleb had shown her how to use. She aimed carefully, her hands shaking, and fired. Another rider stumbled, his horse rearing in panic. The air filled with the roar of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Caleb moved with a speed that belied his age, firing again and again, forcing the outlaws to take cover. Elara stood beside him, a silent sentinel, her eyes narrowed, her grip firm on the rifle. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows that danced and writhed across the canyon floor. The light was fading fast, making it harder to see, harder to aim. But Caleb wouldn't give them the advantage of darkness. He kept firing, keeping them pinned down. Jacob, meanwhile, had retreated into the cabin, cowering behind the furniture. He was a coward, Elara realized, a parasite who had brought this chaos upon them. Her fear turned to anger, a cold, burning rage that fueled her resolve. The scarred man, his face contorted with fury, yelled, "Enough! We're going in!" He charged forward, firing his gun wildly. Caleb met him head-on, their bodies colliding in a brutal clash. The scarred man was bigger, stronger, but Caleb was fueled by desperation and a fierce protectiveness. They grappled, wrestling for control of their weapons. The scarred man landed a blow, sending Caleb staggering back. He raised his gun, ready to deliver the final shot. Elara saw her chance. She raised her rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. The scarred man staggered, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. He crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering beside him. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the remaining outlaws, and the soft whimper of Lena from inside the cabin. Then, chaos erupted again. The two remaining riders, seeing their leader fall, unleashed a furious barrage of gunfire. Caleb, still reeling from the scarred man's blow, was caught in the crossfire. He cried out, clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. Elara rushed to his side, pulling him behind the relative safety of the wagon. "Caleb!" she cried, her voice filled with fear. He looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes filled with pain. "Get the children," he gasped. "Get them out of here." Suddenly a voice cut through the din. "It's in the well. The gold's hidden in the well." It was Jacob. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his hands raised in surrender, his face a mask of fear and desperation. He was looking directly at the remaining outlaws, betraying the secret Caleb had risked his life to protect. Elara stared at him, her heart sinking. She couldn't believe it. Jacob, Caleb's own brother, was willing to sell him out to save his own skin. The two outlaws exchanged glances. Then with a yell, they turned and raced towards the well, abandoning their fight with Caleb and Elara. Elara knew she had to act fast. Caleb was badly wounded, and the outlaws would be back once they retrieved the gold. She couldn't stay here. "We have to go," she said, her voice urgent. Caleb shook his head, his face contorted with pain. I can't move." Elara's mind raced. She couldn't leave him, but she couldn't stay either. The outlaws would be back, and she had to protect Thomas and Lena. She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with tears. "He'll be back," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise. Just hold on." She grabbed Thomas and Lena, pulling them out of the cabin. They were crying, clinging to her skirts, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. "Come on," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "We have to go." She led them towards the horses, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was making a desperate gamble, leaving Caleb behind. But she had no choice. She had to protect her children. As she helped Thomas and Lena onto the back of one of the horses, she glanced back at Caleb. He was lying on the ground, his eyes closed, his face pale and still. She didn't know if he was alive or dead. With a sob, she mounted the horse behind her children. She kicked her heels, and the horse surged forward, carrying them away from the cabin, away from Caleb, away from the chaos and violence that had shattered their fragile peace. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get her children to safety. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their lives would never be the same again. The thunder of hooves faded behind them, swallowed by the vast emptiness. Elara rode hard, Thomas clinging to her back, Lena nestled in front, their small bodies trembling. She pushed the horse until its flanks were slick with sweat, until the cabin, the gunfire, and the image of Caleb lying still became a distant, horrifying memory. They rode until dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold. Elara found a small hidden spring, a place to rest and water the horse. She dismounted, her legs shaky with exhaustion. Thomas and Lena stumbled to the ground, their faces pale and drawn. They were alone, adrift in a landscape that offered both beauty and peril. Elara knew she couldn't stay here. The outlaws would be searching for them, for the gold. She had to find a safe place, a place to heal and regroup. And then she had to go back for Caleb. She spent the day resting, rationing the meager supplies she had managed to grab from the cabin. She cleaned Thomas and Lena's faces, washing away the grime and the fear. She told them stories, tales of brave pioneers and resourceful women, trying to instill in them a sense of hope and resilience. That night, under a sky ablaze with stars, Elara made a decision. She would head to Redemption, the nearest town. It was a risk, but she had no other choice. She needed supplies, information, and most importantly, help. The ride to Redemption was long and arduous. Elara pushed herself, and the children, driven by a fierce determination to survive. She kept a watchful eye on the horizon, wary of any sign of danger. She knew the outlaws could be anywhere. When they finally reached Redemption, Elara was struck by the town's gritty, lawless atmosphere. Saloons lined the dusty streets, their doors swinging open and shut, spilling out raucous laughter and the clinking of glasses. Men with hard faces and calloused hands swaggered along the boardwalks, their eyes scanning the crowds. Elara felt a shiver of apprehension. This was not a safe place. But she had come too far to turn back now. She found a small, run-down hotel on the edge of town. The owner, a wizened old woman with kind eyes, took pity on her and offered her a room at a discounted rate. Elara spent the next few days gathering information, trying to learn what she could about the outlaws and the gold. She discovered that the scarred man was named Jedediah Stone, a notorious bank robber with a reputation for ruthlessness. She also learned that the gold was worth a fortune, enough to set her and her children up for life. But money was the last thing on her mind. She only cared about Caleb. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch of the hotel, watching the sun set over the desert, she saw him, a familiar figure, walking slowly down the street, his face pale and drawn, his arm in a sling. It was Caleb. Elara's heart leaped with joy. She ran towards him, tears streaming down her face. "Caleb," she cried, "you're alive." He stopped, his eyes widening in surprise. "Elara," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" She rushed into his arms, hugging him tightly. "I came back for you," she said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't leave you." He held her close, his grip firm and reassuring. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Had been found by a passing wagon, barely clinging to life. The driver, a circuit preacher, had nursed him enough to travel, depositing him at Redemption." Caleb coughed, a deep rattling sound that shook his frame. Elara guided him to a chair on the porch, its paint peeling under the harsh sun. He looked thinner, older than the few days that had passed since the shootout. The preacher patched him up good enough to travel, but the bullet wound had taken its toll. "Redemption ain't exactly a garden spot," he rasped, his gaze sweeping the dusty street. Elara smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in what felt like years. "We're alive, Caleb. That's a start." She settled Thomas and Lena at their feet, handing them each a piece of hard candy bought with the last of their coin. The children, still wary, clung to Caleb's legs. Weeks crawled by. Caleb slowly regained his strength, though the limp remained. Redemption offered little in the way of opportunity, but it offered anonymity. Elara took in laundry, her calloused hands scrubbing clothes from dawn till dusk. The work was hard, but it provided a meager living and kept her mind occupied. Then came the spring. A spring unlike any Elara had ever witnessed. The winter rains, heavier than usual, had coaxed life from the seemingly barren earth. Overnight, the desert exploded in color. Wildflowers carpeted the landscape, a vibrant tapestry of reds, yellows, and blues. Poppies danced in the breeze, their delicate petals shimmering in the sunlight. Cactus blooms unfurled, revealing intricate patterns of thorns and vibrant inner beauty. Elara found herself drawn to the spectacle, a sense of wonder stirring within her. She started small, clearing a patch of land behind the hotel. She scavenged for seeds, trading favors for a handful of beans, a sprig of herbs. She watered the parched earth with what little water she could spare, coaxing life from the dry soil. Slowly, painstakingly, a garden began to emerge. Rows of vegetables sprouted, their leaves a vibrant green against the red earth. Fragrant herbs filled the air with their pungent scent. And amongst them, wildflowers bloomed, a riot of color that mirrored the landscape beyond. The garden became Elara's sanctuary, a place of peace and solace in a world of uncertainty. She spent hours tending to it, her hands in the dirt, her mind at ease. She found a rhythm in the work, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She taught Thomas and Lena about the plants, about the miracle of life that could spring forth from even the harshest environment. The flowers, she realized, were more than just beautiful. They were a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life could find a way. Just like the desert, scarred and barren, she too was capable of blooming again. And maybe, just maybe, redemption could be a place to build a new life, a life rooted in the hard-won earth, a life touched by the unexpected grace of a desert bloom. Caleb, watching her from the porch, saw a light in her eyes he hadn't seen before. He knew then they were going to be all right. Jacob lingered on the edge of town, a shadow against the fading light. He hadn't spoken a word to Caleb since that day at the cabin, the unspoken betrayal hanging heavy between them. Elara watched him, her expression unreadable. She saw the shame etched on his face, the regret that twisted his features. But she also saw the potential for further pain, for a wound that might never fully heal if he remained. Caleb, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a branch, simply stared. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice raspy but firm. "Get on, Jacob, and don't come back." Jacob flinched, as if struck. He didn't argue, didn't plead for forgiveness. He simply nodded, a jerky, almost mechanical movement. He mounted a sway-backed mare Elara had bartered for, a creature as weary and worn as he was. He turned her west, towards the setting sun, and without another glance rode away. Elara watched him until he was nothing more than a speck on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the desert. A part of her felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by a fierce protectiveness for Caleb and the children. She turned to Caleb, placing a hand on his arm. His face was etched with weariness, but his eyes held a quiet resolve. "Is gone," she said softly. Caleb nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. He made his choice. He knew, deep down, that Jacob was gone for good. Not just from redemption, but from their lives. The bond of brotherhood, once so strong, had been irrevocably broken. Elara squeezed his arm. "We have each other," she said, her voice filled with unwavering love. He looked at her, his eyes softening. He saw the strength in her, the resilience that had carried them through the darkest of times. He saw the love that shone in her eyes, a love that had sustained him when he thought all was lost. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. "We do," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He looked down at Thomas and Lena, who were playing quietly in the dirt, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes bright with hope. The future was uncertain. Redemption was a hardscrabble town, a place where survival was a daily struggle. But they had each other. They had the garden, a small oasis of beauty and hope in a desolate land. And they had the quiet, enduring love that bound them together. A love that had been forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the harsh realities of the West. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elara and Caleb stood together, hand in hand, watching their children play. The wind whispered through the wildflowers, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of a new beginning. The West remained wild and unforgiving, but in that small patch of earth, a new life was taking root. A life nourished by love, resilience, and the enduring power of human connection. The cowboy silence held the weight of knowing some wounds never truly heal, but love can still bloom in the dust.